My name is Gregory Walker, and I'm the son of composer George Walker. It's a thrill to see a quartet like the Ivalas tackle one of my father's demanding works, one of the ones that he wrote very early on in his own career. My father was born in 1922, so he comes out of a generation of American composers. Some of you may be familiar with Aaron Copland, contemporary coming out of Philadelphia in the Curtis School of Music he attended, Samuel Barber, and one can even hear those kinds of influences in my father's music. I think that there is an element of the rugged individualist that permeated particularly his own later works, and an aspect that I think that he not only shares with composers like Beethoven on the program, but even Clifford Still himself. At the same time, this music being so early in his career reflects these influences that he grew up with, that he wanted to be part of the shared tradition, and the influences would definitely include Beethoven, so it's very appropriate, something I think he would appreciate, that he's been programmed alongside his idols in this sense. My father started his career as a piano prodigy, and he had hoped for a chance to kind of be a representative for his race and establish a reputation and output that was available throughout the United States and Europe. But if you think about it, 1940s, 1950s, this wasn't much of an option for a black pianist, automatically considered a novelty, which is another reason why it's just very poetic that the Ivalas Quartet has not only got a phenomenal career arc ahead of them, but is actualizing the kind of career my father would have hoped for back in the day. When we listen to an earlier work, like this First String Quartet, which is the very first published chamber work from his output, we not only hear these influences, but we have three movements, the middle of which at one time was actually one of the most well and widely performed pieces of American music by a living American composer. And it's something that's been excerpted as the lyric for strings, which is performed all over the world every month. The opportunity for me to hear the Ivalas play this quartet of the context of the outer movements, and to be able to share with you this vision he had that involved classical techniques, the counterpoint, his interest in the formal elements of the great tradition of European music, as well as his own individualistic flair, his own particular brand of emotional expression, is something that I'm just so appreciative that we'll get to experience here in performance by the Ivalas Quartet.
The second piece we'll perform for you is the second movement of George Walker's String Quartet No. 1, Lyric. We love this piece, it's very beautiful, and we chose it because George Walker was actually a contemporary of Clifford Still. Please stay tuned for an interview with George Walker's son, Gregory, after this performance. We hope you enjoy it.
We are the Ivalas Quartet, and we're here with Gregory Walker, the son of George Walker, who's string quartet number one. Ivalas has been living with and working with for almost a year and a half now. Yeah, a year and a half now, and we are so excited to finally make contact with you and be able to ask you some questions and learn more about your father and his work, and if you have any words of wisdom for us. So we're really excited. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to go down memory lane and remember my dad and represent his point of view, his perspective as the best I can.
Well, thank you so much. So we have a few questions for you, and hopefully we can get through all of them with the time's sake, but we're curious. We heard a little bit from you earlier about how your father was as a composer, and just how his intentions were with the music. Can you talk a little bit or tell us a little bit about just generally how your father was as a composer and how he notated his music and just things like that?
Yes, well, I'd probably implied that he's known to be pretty picky about such things as his notation and not only his own intent, but you probably know that he was a fairly prominent pianist, and his approach to the classics, to other composers, was just this more and more so as his career went on, and he could be listening to performances, recordings of legendary pianists, and he'd still say, that guy screwed up the rhythm there. That guy took too many liberties. So it did turn into a little bit of an obsession with him. From the point of view of a performer now, it's like, all right, we know that whatever is there, he probably felt pretty strongly about. At the same time, you may have noticed that there aren't a lot of things that are notated that really bring a performer to life in terms of just like emotional, expressive indications and all that. Because not necessarily a sentimental guy in that respect. He believed that that potential was there for a gifted performer to bring out, but he certainly was not going to dictate or ask for that kind of emotional response. But he's of the school, I think, that would suggest that if you just nail all the notations that are there, then the rest of the beauty and expression will just manifest itself automatically.
In the music. That's really interesting because we were introduced to the string quartet number one through the lyric that was done for string orchestra, and that piece is just so incredibly powerful and moving and emotional. So that's a really interesting perspective that the music itself could do that musicality and emotion without having to write it. That's really interesting.
Something about that and my memory of his character. You probably know that that middle movement, turned into lyric for strings, is dedicated to his grandmother. And in fact, most of his works were dedicated to somebody, usually his parents. And everything I've said about what he expected from the performer and his notation holds true. But his own memory of his parents, having them brought up in a conversation, especially the mother and father, lesser extent, I guess, with the grandmother that he did not know as well, but invariably talking about some memory of the parents, the tears would begin to flow. Wherever you were, there was this intensity behind his own experience with these dedicatees that imbues the music, but you're not going to see that notated anywhere in there. And we probably all in our instruction through the years have heard the phrase, don't wear your heart on your sleeve when you're playing Bach or whatever. This is kind of where we're going with the whole thing. It's not a sentimental act. There's a deep intensity going on in there. If you sensed it, whether it's in the lyric or any of those other movements or any other pieces, you weren't hallucinating. But you're going to go at it the hard way. You're going to go at the honest way. You're not going to wear your hearts on your sleeves.
That's really interesting too, because as performers, there's almost a little bit of permission in that way to dig deep for how, when you perform, and to find the deepest levels of emotion that you have to portray into the music. And I think there's a little bit of a reason why we've been clinging to this piece and performing it as often as possible. We are a very emotional group in many ways.
Tissues, please.
Yeah, for good and bad maybe, but we're I think we're really drawn to pieces that have very heavy emotions, you know, in many different ways. So that's a really interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing that with us. That really does change the way I think about the string quartet already immediately. So that's, yeah, we should play it again soon.
It's funny also, you answered one of our later questions we were going to ask, which was about the dedication to his grandmother.
Yeah, we've been wondering about that.
Yeah.
So it's really awesome.
Yes. Well, the story there, I think, has been repeated in other contexts, that this grandmother was part of the nuclear family in the house where he grew up in Washington, D.C. And she was kind of like from another planet in some ways. She didn't speak very much, but she was this quiet presence at all times, and he was just deeply aware of her, even if it was the parents who were kind of giving him most instructions as a little kid. And he was only at home in this environment when he was a little kid, because by the time he was 14, he was already off at the Oberlin Conservatory.
Right.
So the irony there is that this grandmother was born a slave in Virginia. And the stories that she could have to tell would have been life-changing just to hear them. But my understanding is that former slaves, people who've been through these other atrocities, don't necessarily feel like talking about what they finally left behind. And so there was this enigma there as well. She had died right before the composition of the string quartet, and he just felt that he wanted to have something to offer her memory.
Wow. Well,
Amazing.
speaking of how he grew up, we were wondering if you could tell us a little bit about his experience as a Black artist in a field and a country that was racist, or that is racist, and discriminatory against people of color, and especially in the time where he was coming up as a composer. We heard a little bit about that from you before, but do you have any more to share about?
Well, you know, I think that the most obvious and insurmountable impact of that for his career was happening early on when he was still aspiring to be a concert pianist. He had the European tours, Curtis graduate, he had all of the qualifications, but it seemed as if his only future was as some kind of a novelty act in the eyes of the few management options there were back in the day. And so going into composition was trying to kind of work around this. Of course, you couldn't get around everything, and he felt as if he was running into obstacles every step of the way. But the thing is, we got to look at the dates here. Here you've got an individual who's born in 1922 to ask, what kind of racial prejudice did you encounter? Kind of looking for some unique angle there. It's going to be like when your grandchildren find out that you lived through 2020.
Yeah.
And they say, well, what was it like for you when you would go outside during COVID? What was that? And it's like, it wasn't like anything in particular for you. Everybody experienced it. It was just, and even years afterwards, it was just a lens through which he saw everything. I imagine that there are instances you can think of in your own lives where you strongly suspect that racial bias was a factor. Certainly when I would run into problems, immediately he would say, it's obviously just because you grew up out of that. The people who were around you, who were burning crosses on your lawn, they're still alive. You're still running into them in the supermarkets decades later. So it's interesting that one wants to look for these little things like, oh my goodness, some orchestra wouldn't play his piece of music because he was black. Those are the least of the problems of people back then.
In that vein, did your father ever, because he obviously witnessed a huge span of time throughout history and in the music field as well, which continues to, need some more transformation, but what did he notice about how the music world was changing? Did he ever say anything like that to you? Did he ever talk about things that would make the music world more inclusive, or?
Well, he definitely had strong feelings. I think for those of us who were spending time with him, one of the most striking aspects of that was, given that, kind of like I've been saying, he was pretty much an artiste, right? That was the focus, not a sociologist, not an activist. And so he just was aware of what he thought was ideal in the production of music. And the digressions from that were the big priority for him. Composers, performers who weren't doing things in the way he thought was ideal was deeply upsetting for him. The limitations that black composers of color experienced were things that were on his mind, certainly as they directly affected him. There were periods then when there were just brief islands of possibility. In the 1970s, one of the few big influential record labels was Columbia. And they had a whole black composers series that came out of nowhere that was, you could call it a launching pad, although it was more just kind of something that allowed for raising of awareness for a number of African American composers. And he was, really thrilled to be part of that. And he quickly emerged to be kind of a leader without just giving his own background and his obvious ability to also perform his music and just present it in these kind of higher profile venues. So that was an opportunity. And periodically after that, through the 80s and 90s, you would have occasional concerts of music by black composers. And between you and me, I would think there'd probably be many composers of other colors, white composers, who would love to have little opportunities like that. But they were just like speckled throughout this desert of the rest of the neglect that was going on. And I think that he expressed his own feelings pretty clearly in a number of articles he wrote. There was actually something from the New York Times that he published bemoaning what was going on. But it's a tough thing. And what I always think about is, if you come out of that era, even if you're dealing with maybe teachers or other more veteran performers who are active in the 80s, back then, if you were an Asian string player, there were still a number of the gatekeepers would think, this person's got some good fingers, but they're never going to understand the nuances of white European music. And of course now, Asian musicians are pretty much the state of the art, when we're going to speak very generally, with some of the top performers around the globe. But so prejudice was coming from everywhere. So what was the question? It's like, man, it's all over the place.
Yeah, we have felt, as we are a young quartet, just, beginning to, look at our careers. We've really firmly decided at this point that we want to play music of composers of color primarily because we want to get this music out and because we love it so much. And, you know, the question comes up, well, we've played this piece last year. Should we play it again this year? And it's like, we play Beethoven every year. You know, we play Mahler every year. And we think this music is on par, if not better, than a lot of the standard repertoire that we are playing. And so, yeah, I think that hearing that that was part of his vision as well is very inspiring, to just get music out there, to not have it be a Black music concert per se, but to be part of a standard repertoire, because there is really only one reason that it's not, you know, part of the standard repertoire. And actually, Ruben had a really good question when we performed the lyric, or the second movement at Weill Hall in Carnegie in January. He asked everyone, you know, have you heard of Beethoven? Have you heard of Piazzolla? And then, you know, have you heard of Walker? And there were a lot less hands that had heard of Walker. And we said, we're gonna play, I know. And we said, we're gonna play these pieces and we would like you to think about why you haven't heard these before. So thank you so much for sharing about your father and his vision, because that's, you know, very inspiring to us as young quartets. The young quartets.
Yes, if I could add one more thing, especially just in the context of the Beethoven you're performing and this experience in Weill Hall and all that, I just think that Dad would have really appreciated your perspective on just the combination of his music with the music of the past masters. He was never overly fond of being lumped together with other Black composers in an all Black thing. It just, that didn't do much for him, although he would always appreciate concerts that were devoted only to his music. But
we'll do one of those in the
funny how that works out. The thing, though, is, while I believe that for your career arc and what you have to offer the music world that it doesn't already have a lot of, you're completely on track. It just makes so much sense. Especially, and I'm speaking for him here, your sensitivity to which music speaks to you, which music is truly on par with some of the old masters, because not all of it is. Sorry to say. But the other thing is that one of the main arguments, I think, for including a lot of my father's stuff, whether it's from this period of the first quartet or later repertoire, is that unlike a number of other great contemporary composers, you look at my father's background, you look at his passions, you look at his skill set, and you see, actually, he's one of the limited number of artists whose work truly is an extension of Beethoven's and Bach's. He studied that stuff and fell in love with it. He was a master of 16th century counterpoint. He taught that stuff. He was obsessed with it. And so, for the audience coming to hear you play Beethoven and all the rest of the great stuff from the standard repertoire, even though there's a bit of a paradigm shift, it's not a culture shock. He's on your side. And his music, I think, embodies this love of the whole tradition that led us to play in string quartets in the first place.
Yeah. As we honestly, anytime we pair, you know, a Mozart or Beethoven with the Walker, no one really compliments us on the Beethovens or Mozarts. It's pretty exclusively almost across the board. I feel like people are interested in the Walker and hearing more of that, and hearing more of his works and wondering where it came from. So yeah, that's awesome to know. And we're gonna do a full. We'll learn the second string quartet. We'll do a full Walker program soon. Get you involved in that. We also were wondering. I mean, you've talked a little bit about, you know, how your father was, and can you talk just a little bit about how he influenced you as an artist? Because you're now a very incredible, you know, violinist and very successful artist, and how was he influential in you getting to where you are?
You know, I think that especially if one has one's own artistic vision that you're aware of early on, the way I kind of experienced my own life, probably a lot of creators are in the same position. You're thinking about not only what can you glean from somebody you love and respect so much, but also how you can make your own mark. And when you look at the career you're hoping for your own group, you think about all the quartets that have coached you, but you think to yourself, there's no way we can do what they did. They're doing just fine. They've got it covered. We need value added by doing something a little different, like maybe some George Walker or other composers. And so it was for me that you can call it just trying to get out from under a shadow or whatever, but I definitely was not going to put myself in the position to compete with someone I knew already just had this command of the idiom. And so probably the main influence is going to involve me just trying to find new pastures, new things to explore that weren't covered. That said, though, I'll always love the emotional intensity I perceive in a lot of his music. I'll always want to bring that. I'll always love the structural integrity. Just the idea that there's something more below the surface. If you're going to spend hours preparing something for performance or composing it, you want there to be more there than just the surface. But more than anything else, maybe, and I don't quite know what to do with it. This guy just was uncompromising. I'm not uncompromising. It's not an easy environment to grow up in, but it's there like kind of like a point of light to see that, and someday I'll figure out what to do with that.
That's powerful. Yeah, I can't imagine having that kind of a presence around you all the time growing up. Yeah. And it's really amazing to think that not only did he just influence you to become an artist, but also that he influenced you in a subconscious way to explore and push boundaries, and that's what makes art so amazing as well. So finally, because I know we have to wrap it up soon, but do you have any words of wisdom or pieces of advice that you learned from your father for us as a young string quartet, since the string quartet number 1 was written, I think, around our ages, a little younger, a little more talented by our age, but
Come on, you're almost there.
around the same age, yeah.
I would say something that comes from 2 different directions. One, what he was thinking about when he would compose his music that I think has kind of a universal application. And in the second way, just what we as performers do with it. More and more as his career went on, he had this vision, the uncompromising thing, and he didn't care what it took to realize that. He didn't care whether the audience was going to get it. And more, he certainly didn't care whether it was going to be hard for the performer to execute. Just get over it or hand it to the next group to play. It wasn't his concern. He didn't, I shouldn't say he didn't care about you. He would care about you a lot if he heard you guys play the way you play. It's just like, oh, what a relief, he would say. And so given this first aspect of like the composer just into their thing, there's the other aspect of just like, what do you do with that? And with maybe some of his later output, even more than the first quartet, it's just like one of those Himalayan mountains. It's got a route that you're going to be the first to traverse. And you've got to figure out where you're going to be pounding the pitons or whatever the heck they use up there, and people will follow you up that route. It's relatively speaking here because in the case of the first quartet, maybe there are a few groups that have performed it around the world. Less and less so with some of the later works. But you got to come up and just be a problem-solving explorer with this stuff. And I can see that you're doing this even with the performance of the lyric, the middle movement. I see you finding your own solutions. And it's a workout, but it's also got its own special reward. And I think it may help if you envision yourself in this role they don't prepare you for in music school. They don't talk about how you're an explorer with an oxygen tank and a pickaxe. But with a lot of this new music that hasn't been performed a lot, music for which there are not a lot of definitive editions, this is the case. And I think it's one of the beauties of our predicament in playing his music.
That's
That's brilliant.
And it's incredible. And I think we should and we will revisit the string quartet #1 in a different way.
Sorry about that.
No. This is amazing. We're so honored to be able to have the time to talk with you, and we've been, dying to for a year and a half, and we can't believe that we get this kind of access to a piece that we've really, really fallen in love with. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, Gregory. It's been incredible. We hope to continue to collaborate and stay in touch about this quartet. We'd love to play it for you sometime. That would be the next dream. But yeah, thank you so much, and thank you to Friends of Chamber Music for giving us this opportunity to connect with you. And yeah, again, we are just very grateful for your time. So thank you.
All right. Absolute pleasure. Best of luck with the performance. And I'll look forward to following your performances and your careers. I'm just so impressed.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot coming from you. Thank you.